welcome to LOA Today. I'm Walt Thiessen. With me today is longtime listener, poet laureate, and Taya master Anne-Marie Young. This is your daily dose of happy. We are so happy you decided to join us today. Anne-Marie, as you know, we have lots of different guests here on the show with lots of different stories to tell, lots of viewpoints, lots of backgrounds. So there was a wide variety that appear on the show, right? Today we're carrying on that tradition a bit because our guest today, he's multi-talented. First of all, he's a talent agent. Second of all, he's a psychologist with certification in hypnosis and NLP. So like, whoa, okay. Already we're on a wide divergent area there. And on top of all this, well, he's into helping people overcome self-sabotage. So like he's like covering a wide range of stuff, which fits in perfectly around here, don't you think?
Absolutely. There's a lot of knowledge there and certainly covers every base.
It really does. Yeah. I mean, is there anything we don't cover there? Maybe. I'm not sure. We'll find that out. But
it's probably covered.
It's probably, yeah. But Dr. Albert Bramante, first of all, thank you for joining us today. We're glad that you were able to take the time.
I want to really thank you, Walt, for having me on here. And I really look forward to having a good conversation with you both, actually.
Sounds great. All right. So first things first, let's find out more about you because, well, first of all, with that background, there's a lot of stuff going on. Usually whenever somebody is involved in something that they're passionate enough that they want to be on a podcast about, there's usually something they went through in their own life that led them there. And that we find is always a great starting point. So give us the starting point. Tell us how you got to here from there.
That's a long story. Now, I sort of, I would say my adversity story would be being born different in a family. So, which I think a lot of people who do this type of work are kind of different. So I was born in a very traditional blue collar family. So athletes, blue blooded athletes. I was the youngest of five, so I have older brothers that were all athletes: football, baseball, hockey, coaching, all of that stuff. For me, I had zero interest in athletics, and my father was a football coach, and so naturally they put a glove or put a helmet on me, tried to put shoulder pads on me, and I had no interest. I had zero skill. Like it was just not.
Yeah, they go together.
Yeah, me throw a ball, I could barely, make it. Or I had very poor very poor hand-eye coordination, because I was also a preemie, and so I had a lot of health problems.
Oh, okay.
Breathing, asthma, pneumonia, constant chronic pneumonia. So I was different, but I loved reading, and I loved. Also, one thing that really made me, quote unquote, the weird one in the family was I had a very strong interest in spirituality ever since I was a little kid.
Okay.
I still am very spiritual, but even back then I was, which was a bit of a, my family would placate me, be like, let's just not talk about that.
Right.
So that kind of went on the back burner. Then in high school, I started reading a lot. Like my sanctuary was the library. And so I became very interested in the brain and the nervous system and neurology and psychology. And that's where I decided I was going to major in psychology. But I also had a sort of creative streak in me. And so I was involved in a high school drama club. I was in a writing club and all of that, literary club. So I was very much interested in the performing arts at an early age. So I did my undergraduate in psychology, of course, got my bachelor's. But during that time, I took some acting classes, I took some theater classes, became very interested in the performing arts. But I was still, tradition and really wired. I'm going to become a research psychologist, clinical psychologist. And good plan up until the fact that I did not get into the first round of PhD programs. They were very PhD programs for clinical psychology are incredibly competitive. So And I found that out the hard way. I thought I was going to get in. I applied to 4 and got turned down from all 4.
Okay.
So that was kind of a humbling experience. But I was also very, again, still interested in spirituality and in hypnotherapy. And I was also starting to get a little turned away in office from clinical psychology because I found that they were not always open to opposing viewpoints. My first kind of experience with the egocentricity of this was when I was taking a senior seminar class in my undergrad year in psychology. We had to pick a career field in psychology that we'd want to research.
Okay.
And I had no formal training yet. So I picked hypnotherapy, and my professor, who was a strict experimental psychologist, looked at my card, looked at me, and handed me back the card and said, be more serious. This is garbage. So, that was like my first, like, oh, wow. So flash forward, I started working in New York City. This is right around 9/11, and I started working with actors. Realized how much I love working with actors because I was doing something else, working with 9/11 survivors and different organizations. So I found myself in the world of entertainment, and I really liked it. But I wanted to still. I was already halfway through I already had my master's. I might as well go for my doctorate. And so in 2004, when I started my first company, I kind of made the vow to my family not to disappoint them that I was going to also, because I think being a talent agent was not on my parents' bingo cards for me.
I can see that. Football, baseball, talent agent. Yeah, it doesn't quite fit into the.
No, it wasn't that. So I was like, I might as well complete my PhD program. So I started, enrolled in the PhD program, and I became interested in looking at actors. So my book Cassidy was self-sabotage. So when I first started as an agent, I was noticing so many actors were self-sabotaging, and so many actors were just shooting themselves in the foot, is what we call it, and missing opportunities, being their own worst enemy. And I couldn't figure out what the problem was. So when I was going for my orientation for my doctoral capstone dissertation, they told us to kind of focus on the topic that we're really passionate about.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of said, what's up with these darn actors? And so that started that rabbit hole. Now, when I was also in the middle of my program was when the book, The Secret, came out.
Okay.
Which I think rocked the community, at least that I was in, because it was a new way. It was something that I kind of knew, but it was like a new way of looking at things. Although it really wasn't new. It was like just repackaged differently. But it was also, very frowned upon when I said in psychology, oh, what about manifestation? Oh, that's correct. Like clinical psychologists were like, nope, not going to look at that.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, they were also demonstrating research about how powerful visualization is.
Mm.
Which I was like, okay, this is like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, but you can only do one side. You can't do the other side.
Right. I learned that the hard way. So, and I just became very disillusioned with not because solely for that reason, but when I was also in my meeting so many professors in my PhD journey, a lot of who were clinical psychologists were saying that they were working with these severely disturbed, clients who had mental illness and severe personality pathology, and they were like, oh, they're bragging like, this has been my client for 10 years, and I'm thinking to myself, something's wrong. If you're seeing somebody for 10 years and they're not getting better, what's wrong here? Right. So I totally just became disillusioned with clinical psychology. I was like, nope, I'm not. but I'm still, I already completed my coursework, so I'm just going to get a dissertation in straight up educational psychology and call it a day.
Now, this
So
period that you're describing, this early 2000s period that you're describing, because The Secret comes out in 2006, I believe it is. That's also the period that the positive psychology movement was starting to take hold. But it doesn't sound like you were really into that part of it.
My training wasn't. I became a part of I was part of the First World Congress in Positive Psychology because I really liked the work of Martin Seligman, from UPenn, who was like the pioneer of positive psychology.
Right.
The study of happiness, the study of gratitude. So I think that was the aspect of it, but it was the opposite of clinical psychology because clinical psych focuses on what's wrong with people, and that's why I think I was like, no, I can't deal with that. What's right with people? Why do we have to label somebody who goes through a trauma and not look at it like as a source of growth, post-traumatic growth? And when I first brought those topics up, it was kind of looked at like, okay, that's nice, but that's not what we're going to focus on here.
Yeah, let's get real. We're living in the real world where we want to have clients for 10, 15 years. So, get on the bus.
Of course. And we want to build the insurance company. We want to medicate them.
Absolutely, yeah.
Get kickbacks.
How do you expect to be able to pay for the house in the Hamptons? Come on.
Right, of course, yeah. That or the fancy car, those trips that they send, and that was like another disillusion because I was like sitting there like, wow, these pharmaceutical companies really treat these doctors well, like with perks and all that. And so just a lot of things kind of like, to go with the deep thing that really like focusing, is this really what I want to do? Now I started finding when I was reading the Psychology Today article, back around the time The Secret was out, there was a thing about learned hypnosis. So I took an initial video course on it through an HMI, which is a college of hypnotherapy in California. So I took a video course and I was like, okay, I like this, but I want to study this more. So I enrolled in a physical actual program in New York City, 150 hours physical transpersonal hypnotherapy program. So, which would probably really, if I want to go visit my old college professor and tell him I was doing transpersonal hypnotherapy, I would probably get thrown out of the office. But I thought that would be, So, but that resonates much more with me than traditional psych.
What you're describing resonates with me too, because I went to college in the late 1970s, graduating in 1980, and I tried Psych 101. It was something that sounded really interesting. I had no experience with any of it before, but I figured, okay, let's check this out. And I was totally disillusioned because everything was about abnormal psychology. And my reaction was, well, what about normal psychology? Oh no, we don't cover that part.
Exactly, and so it was just, or even when I started becoming interested, because I really didn't. The reason why I was also disillusioned, I found out about positive psychology on my own. I did not find it anywhere in my training, my traditional training. All throughout my bachelor's, master's, and doctorate, I was actually at a psychological convention, the APA convention, and I listened to a keynote presentation that Martin Seligman had given. And I was like, I wish I could study under this man. This is where it goes. And I feel like, while he may not talk about or directly reference The Secret, or I felt like a lot of the principles are resonating with that.
Yeah, there's a lot of
overlap. Yeah. So that's where I became really focusing on. And then even on the transpersonal side, which really I think aligns with the law of attraction principles, is really where I feel at home. So that's kind of like where I'm at. And so I've always been a very deep person, very deep, which again, not exactly a match. So I had a great family upbringing. I'm not going to say that, but I also was very different.
Mhm.
So I was a loner because
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't know how to identify, and I'm sure they weren't comfortable identifying with me either. So, and it wasn't that no ill will, but it was just to a point where I was different,
Sure.
and that's the way it is. So, I'm extremely passionate. I love what I do now, and so that's kind of like me in a nutshell. My story.
Yeah, that gives us an idea. Well, you were a maverick, not so much by choice, but by circumstance. It's like I'm studying all this. I'm becoming expert at this. Wait a minute, I don't like this. This is not what I had in mind. This isn't what I
Yeah.
signed up for. I need something different. Oh no, you can't have. That's what you were up against. That's what you were.
Yeah, of course. And a constructive confession, which I never really said publicly, but I took Gen Psych. When I took Gen Psych, I became disillusioned. I was like, do I really want to major in psychology? Because this is not fun
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah.
So and so but it wasn't until I took other classes that was like, this is really what I want to do. But you're right, it is focusing so much on what goes wrong. Even today, it's like, okay, what's the person's diagnosis? Where can we medicate them? I'm like, okay, that's not going to work.
Yeah, I have another friend who is a co-host here on the show. I do a second show on Mondays with him. He was one of my first guests 12 and a half years ago, and he has a background as a therapist. He's currently a life coach. He tells a story about how he has some friends who are psychiatrists who are really good psychiatrists, but there was one psychiatrist who he wasn't quite so friendly with, but he knew and had some association with. And that psychiatrist used to brag about how quickly he could get people through his office so he could collect the fees. So how many patients could he process in a day, medicating every single one of them?
Right. And keeping them quiet and like zombies, and then, not solving the problem.
And what a great job I'm doing by doing that. That's the way he was literally looking at it.
Well, yeah, the pharmaceutical companies must have loved him, and
oh, sure,
rewarding him with bonuses and all that stuff, and it's very, very, very complex. I also don't, because I've researched, and what I don't, not a fan of medications, especially psychiatric medication, is that it's very unpleasant for the person going through it. The side effects for a lot of them are extremely hard.
Yeah.
And also counterproductive, because I was sometimes I'll read, like, see ads for antidepressants. I'm like, well, call suicide ideation. I'm like, don't you think that would be counterproductive for somebody who's depressed? To start, going towards suicide. So that's one thing I never really understood. Or they would read through these lists of side effects. I'm like, I'll just stick with my symptoms. Sometimes when I hear these side effects, now even some prescription medication for other medical issues, I'm like, I'll read this long laundry list of side effects, and I'm thinking to myself, I'll just deal with the condition. That seems a lot easier than the actual side effects.
Yeah, there was a British television series from the 1990s. I'm sure Anne Marie knows it, starring Judi Dench, called As Time Goes By. And there was a particular scene in one of those episodes in which Judi Dench's partner, Lionel, was talking about how he had seasickness pills subscribed to him. And one of the side effects was nausea.
Yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, no, I get that. I think that's enough from the seasickness.
Yeah, that's right. Like, do I need the pills that bad? Really?
I mean, that's crazy. So yeah, I respect medicine. I'm not a big, necessary believer in that. And I could never, prescribe any, because also during this time when I was going for PhD, they were also starting to advocate, can PhDs prescribe medicine? And I was against that, because I don't really feel like that's so important. I really don't feel like that is, a fact without a medical degree. And even medical degrees don't really know what they're doing sometimes when it comes to medicine.
You fit in very well around here. I can tell you that right now.
I kind of get the impression
also
that
true. When
I
became interested. Now, what were you going to say? I can.
So I was gonna say, I never get the impression that people aren't like encouraged to feel emotions anymore, and that's probably where that self-sabotage comes in, because they're so scared of feeling that failure and feeling those emotions that you just want to numb it.
Right. And that the one thing, that I will say for traditional psychology is you need to feel these feelings a lot of times, sometimes, because that's the only way to go to the other side of it. And that's why I feel like with hypnosis and hypnotherapy and a lot of the somatic work that I've, been encountered with and I've studied is going through it. Now, even at the moment, it may not be pleasant. And I even think a lot of times therapists and psychiatrists are uncomfortable when they see other people in distress. Because what's the first thing you do when someone's crying? Here, a tissue, wipe your tears.
Mm.
Don't cry. Here, wipe your tears. Sometimes I'm like, in my head, I'm like, these people, that's what they need. Let it out.
Mm.
If that's what it needs to happen, let it out. Because, and that's what I even said this when I would say to my students, because I've also been a college professor, so, and I'll tell my students this, that I would much be more comfortable around someone who's bawling their eyes out than someone who's too calm, who has it all together. Because I'm worried then that person's going to snap, at some point and lose it. And you're right. Everything is like, okay, here, do this, not to feel feelings. And, and even another thing, sometimes even I think in the self-help community or the yoga community, there's sometimes a little bit of that, don't be negative, be positive all the time. Namaste. 100% of the day, everything must be positive. Don't worry, be happy. And I feel like sometimes that minimizes a person's pain. It trivializes their pain. It trivializes their experience, and it sometimes can be even insulting. So I'm not sure how much familiar with it, but one of the things I like, been studying a lot and reading a lot about the concept of the shadow. Which is the part of us, the part that we may not really want to be looking at, the human side of us.
Mm-hmm.
And we all have it. So we're not perfect human beings. And that, I think a lot of times we're uncomfortable. Most people are comfortable talking about. So
Which is odd, really. I mean, now this is going to reflect my viewpoint, but I honestly can't define what perfect means anyway.
I don't know either. Like when I'll even hear psychologists be like, and a normal functioning thing, and I want to raise my hand and say, okay, can you tell me what normal is?
Yeah, right.
Can you explain to me what it means to be normal? Because I don't understand that. Because I think the concept of normal is subjective, and it's it could vary from person to person, culture to culture. So
it's
what
also
is normal
too, because the norm is literally right in the middle. It's the average. And is there ever anybody that you encounter who's completely average?
No.
I mean, I can't ever say having encountered anybody like that. Everybody has their differences, their own things that make them different from everybody else. That's the nature of being a human being.
Right. Well, that's the whole thing too. That the whole idea is to let people be exciting about that.
Yeah.
Let there be excitement when it comes to that. How people are different in a sense, and so that is something that really resonates with me, and so I really feel connected more towards the metaphysical types, the ones that would be considered the weird ones. I love
You're definitely in the right spot. This is woo-woo.
Yeah. I love being on the Woo Network, and when I was growing up as a kid, one of the differences is I had a few people who describe me as you're weird, like tell me you're weird, and now I look at that if somebody said you're weird, I'm like, yeah, thank you, I am.
Thank you. Yeah.
I am weird.
Yeah.
So that's something that I know, like in a sense, we're trying to know, because again, what is weird? Because again, that's another subjective concept. Because what
there's a piece of this that also comes to my mind. We were talking about the average, the norm a moment ago, right? And there's really no such thing as an average or normal person. But I do know of people that I've encountered who present themselves as if they're average, as if I'm just an average person. I'm just normal. And what occurs to me is that every time I hear somebody saying that, what they're really saying is, I don't really have a lot of confidence in myself, so I'm just going to kind of slide in under the wire here.
Yeah, or not only that, I'm going to try to fit in and you know, hopefully they'll accept me, and I'm going to be inauthentic, and you know, what good is that? And you're not going to be happy. So for me, you know, I also fit in. One of the reasons why I think I'm drawn to hypnosis and hypnotherapy is because there's a lot of people, especially my colleagues at conferences. I go to a lot of hypnosis conferences. There's a lot of people that are law attraction practitioners. So I'm really excited by that. And so, because I do believe that manifestation is effective, and I do believe that.
Well, I mean, manifestation is one of those terms that, you know, it gets bandied about in a lot of different ways. But the bottom line is that everything in life manifests. We can disagree about how it manifests, but literally everything manifests. Everything.
Oh yeah.
If anything that showed up, guess what? It just manifested.
Yeah. But it gets bandied, I think, or in a like, you know, again, that little way of like, hey, I'm just gonna manifest something. I'm like, no, you know, you're gonna create something because you're working towards it, and there's no reason why it can't happen because you work towards it. So that was sort of like where I became, you know, interested in this, because I'm like, okay, you know, the same psychologists that were bashing or talking negatively about the law of attraction are also saying how positive thinking is important. Like, well, that's manifestation right there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, and also I'm a big component of visualization. So one of the things I really guide my, you know, acting clients and my students to do is to visualize. And that's really what manifestation is.
What that you like about visualization?
One of the things that I like about it is the brain does not know, and this is by science, fact is that the brain does not know the difference between reality and fiction. So if you are manifesting or visualizing yourself being successful and smart, you're going to act that way, and things are going to happen that are going to be aligned with that. So, and I'll tell you stories, you know, because I work as an agent. So my primary day-to-day responsibility is finding work for actors in New York. So when I first was rising up in the community as an agent, I was walking around telling people that I was booking people in primetime film and TV, which at that time was a bit of a stretch of the truth at the current moment. But I owned it. And then maybe a month, not even like 6 weeks later, I had three multiple placements in the same week in prime time. So it's the act as if it's happening phenomenon. Yeah, one of the stories that one of the actors that, you know, one of the well-known actors today, Jim Carrey, had mentioned this in several speeches that that when he was starting up as an actor, he wrote himself a check dated 3 years ahead of time for $10 million.
Right. Yeah.
For acting services rendered. And he looked at it every day. And sure enough, 3 years later, he was offered a role for Dumb and Dumber, which was a $10 million contract. So this stuff is real, in my opinion.
It's real, and it's fun too. It's fun to explore the reality of it. It's also a challenge, though, and it does tie me back to what you were talking about earlier, in that you described your own things that you had become not happy, shall we say, about psychology and where psychology had been going and so forth. But I'm imagining there are probably some areas that you liked, and I wondered if you could talk about that side of it.
I liked, just the actual explaining behavior. I like the dynamics, the why of things. I like, some of the early theories of personality, like Jung and Adler and Erickson and all those people. So I like the explanation of behavior. I like the importance of like early childhood experiences and how that shapes somebody. And but I also feel like the reason why I like that because we can use that same knowledge and help someone rewire their. So it's knowing how they happen. Now it's how can we change that? So that's what became very fascinated by it. And I still read books today on behavior and self help and all that because I'm really just interested in that topic. So there are things I like. I just wasn't crazy about the overly pathologizing people
Which
and
yeah,
finding things wrong or shoving medicine down someone's throat, literally in a sense.
yeah. There's a
That would
lot of
make,
over medication. There's no doubt about that.
and especially now, even with children,
Oh,
and
yeah,
teenagers.
yeah. Well, I mentioned my friend Joel, who I do the other show on Monday with. He does a lot of work, volunteer work with young boys in the foster care system, and he will tell. Often he'll tell the story of what it's like to have interviewed one without giving out details of who they are and so forth. And inevitably, one of those stories includes being currently at the time that he meets them for the first time, being on like 10 different medications because and having seen 10 different psychiatrists who prescribed each of the 10 different medications without talking to each other or figuring out what the other ones were and so forth. Just like pile the stuff on. That's the way we'll deal with the fact that this kid is basically traumatized because he's in the foster care system and came out of a family that was completely dysfunctional. Yeah.
And so what I would kind of think about her cases like that, I'm like that. So nobody's dealing with that. You want to medicate him, this child, but not work through the trauma and heal the wound, the psychological wounds that he's experiencing. Because all you're doing is just putting bandages on him and walking away.
Right.
And eventually they just become zombies, pretty much these kids, and they're there's no shell there now. It's easier to deal with them, sadly, at that point because it's like they're just you know like almost just walking dolls in a sense. It's like okay, I
Mm-hmm.
can do it too. I'm quiet, but I would think like when I hear kids like that, is anybody working with this kid on the trauma? Is anybody working through that? So that's what I would sort of like look at because you have to go to the root cause and figure and even when kids are removed, there's abandonment issues. There's breaks in attachment. He was probably abused, especially in the foster care system.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
These
Well,
children are
there's usually some sort
trauma.
of abuse, but there's usually also other things going on. So, for instance, maybe one of the parents was a drug user and ended up in jail. Maybe there's somebody who died. Maybe there's maybe one parent was beating up the other parent. I mean, there's a lot of different scenarios that play out, all of which can affect the kid.
Yeah, it will affect, and that needs to be dealt with and worked through. And medication is not going to do that.
No.
So that's where I became like totally disillusioned with the traditional psychology model of things because that's not that's not handling it.
It's also one of the sources for some of the best stories that we talk about here on the show because Joel brings these stories to the show, and Joel was one of the very earliest therapists to try to incorporate LOA into his practice. And he did it particularly with these kids. He likes to tell stories about how, for instance, there was one kid who came to him, I think, at age 9 and had like the weakest handshake he'd ever experienced in his life. And when he asked the kid to, just tell me about himself. Well, first of all, this was one of many kids. He tends to get the kids that the social workers can't handle anymore. So they're the worst cases. They're the ones that don't fit in to the home. They don't fit in at school. They're troublemaking all over the place, always in trouble. And then they say, well, maybe Joel can help him. He pulls off these miracles, so we'll send him to Joel. So Joel sits down with him and says, so, tell me about yourself. Tell me about who you are. And the kid will start listing all the medications that he's on and all the diagnoses that he's had. And Joel's saying, no, I just want to, do you play soccer? What do you like to do? But the kid is so identified with all the different therapies that he's been put on that he thinks that that's what his identity is. And it's one of the first things that helps to unravel is that, no, that's not your identity at all. And in fact, they usually find that, in fact, with that particular case, the one that I was just telling you about, that one was remarkable because he basically explained to this kid the power that this kid had within himself, his power to choose what he's going to believe, what he's going to give attention to, all that kind of thing. And in the course of one session, the kid completely got it. He also taught him about the basics of law of attraction. He completely got that too. And he asked Joel to accompany him to the next meeting with his psychiatrist, which Joel did do. Of course, the psychiatrist is like eyeing him like, what the hell are you doing here? But he showed up with a kid, and the kid basically started quizzing the psychiatrist on, why is it that you have me on all these different medications? And what can you tell me about the interactions between the medications? And he's just like hammering, this 9-year-old is hammering the psychiatrist on all these different issues about, the medications that the kid's on. And finally, the kid says, I want you to take me off of all these medications because they're not doing me any good. And the psychiatrist is looking at Joel like, what the hell did you do to this kid?
You did
practice. What are you doing?
You're ruining my gravy train.
Exactly.
Well, you're ruining, and that it's sad, and it's true. I mean, what are the medications doing? I have to decide with the kid, because many times it's not even just labeling these kids as problems. It's looking at them as problems, and they're not looking at them as friends. And a lot of times, that's why these kids will test you, the authority, because they're expecting to be tossed aside, especially if they've been through the foster care system. So I think, to see somebody genuinely interested in them is, whoa.
Oh, yeah.
A change.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened in this case. The kid fired his psychiatrist, which was apparently a sight to be seen. He went home to the foster home where he stayed in and apologized to his foster mother for behaving poorly. And then he went to his school and apologized to his teacher for behaving poorly in the class, became an A student. I mean, he just completely turned his life around simply because somebody told him he had agency over his own life for the first time ever.
Yeah. And that they're actually worthy. I mean, that's what really I would believe too, that they need to know these kids is they're actually worthy of love, and that they're worthy, and they can do great things. And then that's what they need. Can you imagine if that was done across the thing? I think we'd see a lot of less, school shootings. I think there'd be a lot less violence. People just knew what they can do and knew that they had a choice.
Well, and there are parents. I mean, Amory's a parent, and I know this is part of what you do, Amory. You work with your daughters. This is, I mean, you don't necessarily address these particular topics because they aren't a part of your daily home life. But I mean, this is the kind of thing you have to do, right?
Absolutely. I bring them up to explore their emotions. I bring them up to ask them what they want, so they can think about what they need, rather than just going, oh, just go and do this or just go do that. What do you need? I think it's very important that we give our kids these skills of resilience and just thinking, feeling their own things, thinking their way through things, being there for them to hold them when they need it, but also giving them that independence to grow and learn.
Yes, that's very, very important. And it's great that you're able to do that. Our guest just got lost, so he's coming back in. But there he is. Okay, we got him back.
All right, back. So.
But what you missed was Anne-Marie was describing how she tries to work with her daughters and how she tries to encourage them to think for themselves and to make their choices and so forth, and to know that they're supported in that way, which is pretty much what you're talking about.
But also to be accountable with their actions. Well, you've done that. That's on you. It's backfired. That's a consequence. I'm not going to fix everything.
Well,
good parent you are.
and that's what I feel with effective discipline is just teaching the consequences of their actions, not getting yourself as a parent emotional, involved. Because a lot of times parents get too emotional. It's like when their child is, misbehave, may not be behaving the way they want them to. And I think when they learn the consequences, and even consequences, I think as negative connotation to it. There's positive consequences too. There's you do a good thing, you're going to get the good things in return. That's a consequence. So
it's also a little bit tricky though, because when we use the phrase "getting emotional," what we're usually meaning by that is, well, having a nutty, going off the deep end. But we also don't want to say, well, you shouldn't be experiencing emotions. I mean, there's a trade-off there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that may be a different way of looking at it, and that what I was trying to describe is, getting invested into it. So, like, in other words, if it's taking it personal, the child's, being rebellious is you getting upset over that person, taking it, because then that will sometimes cause you to overly respond aggressively or harshly to the child,
Right.
and that. But however, at the same time, there's holding the child's accountability. I think is important,
Mm-hmm.
and accountability is extremely important. And so I do see a lot of problems. I think especially with what some people would say with a Gen Z, is that there's sometimes can be a lack of accountability.
Well, you mentioned that you work a lot with actors, people in the entertainment industry. So I imagine that also includes Gen Z, because that's where a lot of people within the industry are going to come from. They're going to come from the younger age groups.
Yes.
It's not something sometimes people make that a late career choice, but not normally. Normally, it's an early career choice.
Yeah, or I've worked with some actors that have been doing this off and on. Maybe they went to, they become an actor, then maybe they had to take a break to raise a family, or they got married and had children, then raised their children, then went back into acting because that was part of their soul. But even with the Gen, I feel like it can be a interesting thing with Gen Z, because I feel in some aspect they may lack accountability, but also at some point they are also mislabeled.
I agree.
And I feel like some of them are very insightful.
Oh yeah, a lot of them are, I would say.
Because even if, and I work with college students, and they are typical Gen Z now, and I was even we were having a discussion once on social media, and like, some of them are not even interested in social media as we would think, Gen Zs are.
Yeah.
And they're saying how social media is dangerous and because it deprives human interaction, which was like really surprising for me to hear that, and refreshing though to hear that.
Encouraging, yeah.
Encouraging, that Gen Zs are actually thinking about that. So, yeah, I mean, but I do think, going back to old discipline, I think there's accountability. I think that's what really is important, more so than actually correct. Because again, sometimes parents try to correct their child to act like them or what they want, their child to be perfect, and it's not happen.
Well, usually they're trying to say, well, I don't want my child to experience what I experienced, so I'm going to make sure they experience the opposite of it.
Which I can understand, but at some point they may need to experience that for their own growth. So
that's the hard part. You want to protect your kid from everything, but you really can't. Not if you want the kid to grow.
Yeah, or you're going to have a principle of what we call failure to launch, because it's like, okay, now you isolated them and protected them from everything, and they get out into the real world. It's like, well, what do we do now? Where do I go?
What were you going to say, Anne-Marie?
I've completely forgotten.
That's all right. We'll come back to it. No problem.
It'll come back.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Bramante, you like you were talking about earlier, you deal primarily with the entertainment, the acting community. In fact, your book is titled aimed. It's pretty clearly aimed at them, rise above the script. So that's a big piece of it. But talk about the book a little bit, and talk about how that ties into what you do regularly.
So as I said, at my earlier talk, I was running into actors that were self-sabotaging, and so I did that for my doctoral dissertation. I kind of figured out what's going on here. So I wrote this book, several years after receiving my doctorate, and I combine research. I do combine research. I talk about personality, self-esteem, fear of failure, fear of success, and how that influences self-sabotaging behavior, and how that can influence self-sabotaging behavior. And of course, it's written for performing artists, but it can be really, applicable to anybody, who deals with this, which is everybody, all walks of life. So one thing about what makes self-sabotage so sneaky is it's not a conscious thing. It's not like we're walking around saying, "Hey, I'm self-sabotaging today."
Yeah.
So
preparing my shrine. I'm a self-sabotager.
Yeah, no, we don't do that. Because we don't realize we're doing it. And so it really takes either some deep reflection or having a coach enough who can point that out and say, "Look, you're having these misfortunes. What's the common denominator here? What's really going on here? Can these things be self-inflicted?" And I think yes.
Sure.
And
I
so
would even argue that they may not have been originally self-inflicted, but thereafter they were self-inflicted over and over again.
Oh yeah, and so the theme of the book in a nutshell is your own worst enemy is really the person looking in the mirror, not and staring at you back, not other people. And that's also one of the hallmarks is people with self-sabotage is those that blame other people. It's because of this person's fault or that person's fault, or I'm not going to be successful. Like even a lot of times they're actors. Oh, the industry doesn't like me. They're too racist, too sexist. I'm like, no. Now, I'm not saying those issues may not exist on some scale, but then let's talk about that because there's that lack of accountability now comes in. So, also one of the things about if you really want to master self-sabotage, you have to take responsibility for your life and ownership. And now, even the experiences that were not so good, I think there's a distinction between taking ownership and taking blame.
Yes.
So I have to own a situation, even if it if I get betrayed or someone kind of does something does me wrong. I still have to take ownership of it to some level. Now I'm not going to blame myself, but I have to take ownership of it because I have control now on how I can act. So what I often talk about in my book is how to take ownership of your career and how to take ownership of your life, so that you can minimize the self-sabotaging patterns.
Yeah, because the self-sabotage is basically like you're describing. It is self-sabotage. It's basically undermining yourself, and it's doing it by replaying the tapes of what previously happened.
Yeah, or you often see this a lot. Even when people speak to you, they're like, oh, I did this last week, but I think it was just too easy. I don't really, like an actor will say, I booked the role, I did a great, but I really, I think they just gave it to me. And I would have to sometimes say, why would you say something like that? You're negating the good thing right there. And you're minimizing your experience. You're minimizing your talent. So that's where I believe that comes in. Or another thing I often say is, and again, this is probably even rooted in some of the law of attraction thing, with manifestation. One of the things I've seen, which I really want to get, hopefully out of the industry's vocabulary, is a starving artist thing. I'm a starving artist. No, you're not. Or I'm a broke actor, so I'm an aspiring actor, or I'm a struggling actor. No, you're not. Because when you say that, you're creating that reality that you are, and that's going to happen. And so one chapter I even talk about in my book is views of money. Because for some reason, I think society has programmed us to have a negative view of money.
Sure.
Growing up. Because we were told, money is the root of all evil, which is actually misquoted.
True.
Because it was really the love of money is the root of all evil.
Which is even that is the actual quote.
Yeah. And I do think that that's actually not accurate. Because
I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, money is neutral.
Mm.
One of the books one of the authors I really started reading a lot, who was featured in The Secret, is Joe Vitale.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing that he, said is that money is neutral, which I still bought. And that's what I, talk about in my book. Money is neutral. It is not a thing. So, but if you internalize that money is ruled over evil, you purchase message going up, and you might even realize that you're doing this consciously, but then your subconscious mind is saying, "Well, I'm not going to be evil. I'm a good person, so therefore I can't have money,"
Mm-hmm.
and that's going to create self-sabotage.
Sure.
So and so that's where I go into too. We need to have a better relationship with money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that relationship with money really has to start with the relationship we have with ourselves.
Yeah,
right?
and our own inherent self-worth.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah.
So
interesting concept there, by the way. We're talking about money and the lack of money, and then the lack of self-worth. Like, oh, okay, money, lack of money, lack of money, lack of self-worth. Like, okay, there's like a parallel going on here.
Yeah. And you can even frame it, and this is what Joe Vitale said in one of his seminars, was even if you wanted to look at money as, okay, selfishness, but look at all the money you can help. Look at all the things you can do to help people if you had more money.
Oh, sure.
So look at it that way too. Okay, you don't have to necessarily spend on yourself. What about your loved ones? What about helping the less fortunate, or charities, or philanthropic causes? What do or just giving back? So you can do that with money, and money can be a force of good, because money is neutral. It's not good or bad. It's just a neutral concept. And so I think also we need to improve our relationship with money.
I agree. Yeah, and that's something that I think more and more people are coming to realization of. They're one of the things that really grabs my attention, because I started this podcast 12 and a half years ago at a time when talking about law of attraction and so forth was still pretty woo-woo and not accepted and so forth. And I'm really amazed at how much in that time period it has become accepted to a much larger degree society-wide. There are still many, many people who think it's a bunch of nonsense, but
Right.
They had enough traction that people say, "Oh yeah, I know, I've heard about that." Sure, as opposed to, "Oh, what a bunch of craziness."
I think even in 5 to 10 years from now, it'll be even more so.
Oh, sure.
Think that it'll be hopefully it'll raise the mainstream, narrative that was years ago, that it'll become now the actual norm, not woo-woo, like, okay, let's actually have these everyday discussions with all people.
And even for people who don't really believe in the whole law of attraction thing, it's amazing how many have taken the verbiage from the whole spiritual movement and applied it in the more practical way in their lives. Like, I want to change the way I talk about money. I want to change the way I think about things. I want to meditate. I want to visualize. I want to do vision boards. They're taking on the props without necessarily giving credit for where it came from, which is fine by me. I don't care how they do it.
Right. And it's still the same thing. I also sometimes run into some people who, when I tell them I do hypnosis or hypnotherapy, are like, I don't want to talk about that. That's evil, or that I can never hypnotize. And then the next question, I'm like, so have you ever meditated? Oh, all the time.
Right. Yeah.
Well, what is that? It's the same thing. And then one interesting anecdote, which I really found humorous, is in New York City. I was attending one of those New Life Expos, and they had this vendor there who was a Christian bookshop, and I was looking at some of the books, and he turned to me and said, so what do you do? And I kind of say, well, I do hypnosis, and his face changed. It's like, oh, no, you can't do that. That's such a, and he was like saying, you need to, you need to accept Jesus and all that. And again, I have total respect for people's religion. So after a while, he was like, you need to have a better relationship with Christ. I said, okay. I returned to him. I said, so tell me what I need to do to have a better relationship with Christ. He's like, okay, you need to take 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, close your eyes, take a deep breath in, and just really focus on the message of God.
He walked right into that one. I'm telling you.
I literally fell over. And he's like out laughing, and he said, "What's so funny?" I said, I looked at him. I said, "You just described hypnosis."
You probably didn't like that too much, but
No, I was kind of done. Conversation was over. I was kind of
yeah.
like, he didn't like necessarily tell me to leave, but he kind of gave me the nonverbals, like, okay, you can leave now. But I walked out of there just hysterical because I was like, this. It's one thing, okay, I get it if you have you're entitled to your viewpoints, but it's just amazing. Or people say, hypnosis doesn't work on me, so you meditate all the time. But yeah, it does work. So that's just interesting, and I think it was relates to what people say. I don't believe in law of attraction. Oh yeah, I do have vision boards. Well, hello.
Yeah. Well, my favorite way to, especially if I'm dealing with someone who's very evangelical, trying to recruit me into their particular church, I'll ask them. They'll ask me what I'm into. I'll describe the LOA piece. They sometimes are accepting of it, but if they're rejecting it, then I'll say to them, "Do you believe in sowing and reaping?" And they'll say, "Yeah, of course I believe in that." And I say, "Well, that's the same thing. We just use different terminology to describe the same thing," and that usually calms them. Interestingly enough.
Yeah, well, and that's sometimes what I'll point out too. And I don't necessarily point out, but well, no, you're just there's multiple ways of looking at something. But we're describing the same thing at the end of the day.
Yeah.
We just might use different terms for it or different, approaches.
Yeah.
Well, great.
This has been a fun conversation. We have 3 things we like to do at the end of our show. And the first one is we'd like to give you a chance to tell people, how do they find you? How do they find Dr. Albert Bramante? Because some people may want to do just that thing.
Sure. Well, you can find me on LinkedIn under Albert Bramante. You can find me on Instagram at Dr. Albert Bramante. You can also go to my website, albertbramante.com, and I have stuff on there. So I have a lot of different audios that you can listen to. They're brief, they're 15, 17 minutes. You can listen daily, and they have all topics related to confidence, to leadership, to athletic performance, addiction, sleep, fears, phobias, all of that. There's a whole big database. Feel free to go to albertbramante.com. I'd love to hear from you and continue the conversation too.
Very good. Okay. And the book again is called Rise Above the Script.
Rise Above the Script, yes. And it's on Amazon. I have it as a paperback, Kindle, and also audiobook. So we're all audiobooks are.
All right, very good. Second thing I like to do is I like to turn to my co-host and ask Anne-Marie to tell us from her point of view. I mean, because she generally plays a relatively quiet role on the show. She'll participate in the conversation, but most of the time she's kind of like representing the listener. And so I like to turn to her because I want to know what's the listener thinking about, and that's my way of finding out. So Anne-Marie, what's the listener been thinking about as they've been listening to the show?
I think for me, there's just so many of the beliefs that I believe in the fact that therapy, concentrating on that, this is the problem and this is a problem and this is a problem and then this happened, that's not actually productive therapy. You just sit in that cycle. So positive psychology is something that my coach is starting to teach us, and the resilience, and I'm just such a huge fan. But I just think, therapy should be about working through, giving you a toolkit to go through life, building that resilience. And I think the thing that's kind of came out of this whole conversation is overall, it's about building a kind relationship with yourself and treating yourself like you would your loved ones, and understanding that you're actually worth your own respect.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yes.
I love it. Thank you very much for that.
Great. Thank you. That's wonderful.
Then the final thing we like to do is this is something I've done for a few years now. This is my response to the age of the internet, because we're having a conversation now that we couldn't have 30 years ago. That was just not a possibility to do this is StreamYard, but it's Zoom, that kind of thing. That just wasn't available. And it's available now, and it's fun and it's great. And we have the social media, we have all the different things that are available online, the blogs, all that kind of stuff. And people like you, like yourself, are sharing information through all these different things. And you're sharing them like we do with people that you'll never meet. You don't know how they're using it, but they're benefiting in ways that you don't even know about. And that's the part that I noticed, that we're benefiting people and we don't get any credit for it. So, Albert, on behalf of those people you've never met, never seen, and never will meet, never will see, who you've been helping in ways that you don't even know about, on their behalf, thank you for what you're doing, because you're making a difference in the world.
Thank you. And so are you. I really think we need more of these conversations and more of these, and more for your message to get across out there. So.
Well, we appreciate your time and willingness to share and do and continue to do what you're doing, and best of luck, and especially with the books. Keep doing what you're doing, because it's good stuff.
Well, thank you, and good luck with keep doing this podcast. We need
thank
more
you,
of
and
that.
thank you to our podcast listeners everywhere. We'll see you all next time here on LOA Today. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.